The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense, the kind of palpable tension that made it feel as though every breath was being held in unison. Judge Amy Coney Barrett sat at the bench, her poised expression giving away nothing. Yet beneath her calm exterior, there was a simmering frustration. The trial had dragged on for days, and each moment seemed to build toward a confrontation. Across from her sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a figure known not just for her political acumen, but for her razor-sharp ability to cut through the facade of power with her words. Crockett had long been a force to be reckoned with, a woman who refused to bow down to the whims of those who thought their authority was unassailable. The case in question had become a symbol of larger national debates: justice reform, political power, and accountability. The stakes were high, and Crockett, with her fiery conviction, had made it clear from the start that she wasn't going to let the court dictate the narrative. Her questions were pointed, often challenging the very foundation of the case and exposing the vulnerabilities of the judicial system. She wasn't afraid to hold the powerful accountable, and her relentless pursuit of truth had earned her both admiration and ire. Barrett, a woman whose rise to the Supreme Court had been marked by both praise and controversy, was a champion of judicial conservatism, priding herself on her impartiality and strict adherence to the law. She believed in order and decorum, and the courtroom was a place where those principles must be upheld at all costs. When Crockett began to challenge the proceedings, questioning the motivations behind certain legal maneuvers, Barrett's patience began to wear thin. It wasn't just the questions themselves, it was the way Crockett, without hesitation, had begun to dismantle the very legitimacy of the process. Her boldness, her unwillingness to conform, irritated Barrett, who had always believed that respect for the court was paramount. At one point, Crockett had interrupted a key witness, calling into question their testimony, not on technical grounds, but on the broader implications it had for the justice system. "If we cannot trust the very people who are meant to uphold the law," she said, her voice unwavering, "then what are we doing here? What is the point of this trial if the truth is obscured by half-truths and political games?" The words hung in the air like a challenge, not just to the witness, but to everyone in the room, including Barrett. The Congresswoman's audacity was undeniable, and it was clear that she wasn't about to back down. Judge Barrett, sensing the potential for this exchange to derail the trial further, leaned forward. Her jaw tightened as she gave a pointed look at Crockett, her eyes narrowing. She had seen politicians like Crockett before, individuals who believed their platform granted them the right to undermine the authority of the court. But this was different. Crockett wasn't just any politician. She was smart, strategic, and unafraid to speak truth to power, even in a room full of people who were far more comfortable in their positions of influence. The room fell into a heavy silence as Barrett prepared to make her move. She cleared her throat, her voice calm but unmistakably stern. "Congresswoman Crockett," she began, each word measured and deliberate. "While I understand your passion, I must remind you that this is a courtroom, not a stage for political theater. If you continue to disrupt these proceedings, I will have no choice but to hold you in contempt." The words rang out like a gavel striking wood, and for a moment, everything in the room seemed to stop. The judge had issued a direct challenge, one that could escalate the situation into something far more volatile. Crockett's eyes never wavered. She wasn't intimidated by Barrett's power or position. Instead, she met the judge's gaze with an unyielding certainty. "Judge Barrett," she said, her voice now calm but tinged with defiance, "this court exists to serve the people, not to protect those who abuse their power. If you want to hold me in contempt for speaking the truth, then so be it. But understand this, I will not be silenced by threats or intimidation." The defiance in her words hung in the air like an electric charge, and for a moment, even Barrett seemed taken aback. She had expected resistance, but this was something different. Crockett wasn't just questioning the system. She was challenging its very integrity, and Barrett had to confront the uncomfortable truth that the lines between her duty as a judge and her personal convictions were beginning to blur. Judge Barrett's attempt to regain control of the courtroom took on a new, more forceful tone. The sharp exchange with Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett had ignited an undercurrent of tension that was impossible to ignore. The judge had expected Crockett to back down, to offer some token concession, but that had not happened. Instead, Crockett had only grown more resolute, standing firm in her conviction that the trial was not just a legal proceeding, but a matter of principle. In that moment, Barrett's patience was clearly tested. With a stiffening of her posture, Judge Barrett's gaze locked onto Crockett's, her voice cutting through the silence. "Congresswoman, your attempts to turn this courtroom into a political spectacle will not be tolerated," she stated, the words deliberate and heavy with authority. "If you continue to undermine these proceedings, you will face the consequences. I will not hesitate to hold you in contempt of court." The threat was stark, and it rippled through the room. There was a collective shift in the atmosphere, the air now thick with anticipation. Many in the courtroom were familiar with Barrett's reputation for firmness. She was seen as a woman who adhered strictly to the law and expected others to do the same. However, the words she had just spoken carried with them the kind of power that not only sought to silence Crockett, but also to quash the growing support that the Congresswoman had among those watching. It was a bold move, but it was also one that had the potential to backfire in ways Barrett couldn't yet foresee. Crockett didn't flinch. She was a woman who had faced much worse in her political career: public ridicule, media attacks, and the constant pressure of being in the political spotlight. What was a courtroom threat compared to the battles she had fought on the floor of Congress? "Judge Barrett," she said, her voice steady and unshaken, "if you think you can intimidate me into silence, you've got another thing coming. I'm here to speak the truth, and I'm not going to be cowed by your authority or anyone else's." Barrett's face remained impassive, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, perhaps doubt, perhaps surprise, or even frustration. She had clearly expected the Congresswoman to back down in the face of her power, to acknowledge the weight of her position as a federal judge and submit to the established rules of the court. But Crockett wasn't playing by the same rules. She wasn't interested in simply following a script. She was there to challenge the very system that had allowed people like Barrett to wield such unchecked power. The exchange, while still ongoing, had already begun to shift the dynamics of the courtroom. Spectators, many of whom had been largely indifferent to the specifics of the case, were now watching intently. Some of them, already sympathetic to Crockett's stance on justice reform, began to murmur among themselves. The tension was no longer confined to just the two women at the center of it all. It had spread throughout the room, with every eye trained on the unfolding drama. In that charged silence, Judge Barrett, realizing that her authority had been openly defied, attempted to reassert control over the situation. She cleared her throat, straightening her papers on the desk before her, trying to regain some semblance of composure. "I'm giving you one last chance, Congresswoman," Barrett said, her voice carrying a heavy edge. "You will stop this disruption immediately, or I will have no choice but to hold you in contempt and have you removed from this courtroom." But Crockett, far from being intimidated, leaned in, her voice gaining strength. "Remove me if you want. The truth will still be out there. You can't hide it no matter how much you try to shut me down." The Congresswoman's words cut through the thick tension like a blade. She wasn't just defying Barrett, she was daring her to take that final step, to carry through with her threat. It was a bold move, one that many in the room had likely not anticipated. Barrett, now visibly rattled, hesitated. She had been in charge of countless courtrooms, and in all of those situations, the authority of the bench had been respected, if not feared. This was different. Crockett wasn't backing down, and it seemed that Barrett's power, at least in that moment, was being questioned in a way she hadn't expected. The courtroom, once a place where the judge had been the undisputed authority, was now a stage for an unpredictable clash of wills. As the standoff between Judge Barrett and Congresswoman Crockett continued, the tension in the courtroom became almost unbearable. Everyone in the room had sensed the shift. What had started as a simple exchange of legal arguments had now transformed into a battle of wills. The judge, who had always been known for her composure and unflappable authority, had made a critical misstep in her attempt to silence Crockett. And now, the consequences of her actions were beginning to unfold in ways she had not anticipated. After Crockett's defiant response, Judge Barrett had been momentarily thrown off balance. Her usual poise seemed to falter as she realized the gravity of the situation. She had expected Crockett to fold under the weight of her power, to back down and allow the legal proceedings to continue without further disruption. Instead, the Congresswoman had stood firm, challenging the very premise of the trial, and more importantly, challenging Barrett's authority. It was a move that would prove to be more significant than either of them could have predicted. The silence in the courtroom stretched long after Crockett's words. Barrett, visibly uncomfortable, shifted in her seat. The eyes of everyone in the room were on her, waiting to see how she would respond. This wasn't just about the trial anymore. This was about her reputation, her authority, and the way she had been perceived by the public and her peers. Her initial threat had been meant to silence Crockett, to remind her of the boundaries of the courtroom, but now it had backfired. It had only made Crockett more resolute, more emboldened, and worse, it had made Barrett appear vulnerable in a way that was deeply unsettling. In a rare moment of hesitation, Barrett glanced down at the papers in front of her, as though seeking guidance from the cold, impersonal words written on them, but nothing in the legal text could help her now. The situation had become personal. She had to confront the uncomfortable truth that her attempt to exert control had only escalated the confrontation, and it was a confrontation that was quickly spiraling out of her grasp. After a long pause, Barrett spoke again, her voice now lacking the sharp edge it had once carried. "Congresswoman Crockett," she began, but the words came out more softly than before, as if she were trying to recover some semblance of control. "Perhaps I was too quick to issue that threat. This is, after all, a matter of due process, and I believe it's important that we proceed with respect for the truth, however difficult it may be." The shift in Barrett's tone was immediate and obvious. The once stern judge who had demanded respect from everyone in the courtroom was now backtracking, her words tinged with a note of regret. It was a rare moment of vulnerability for Barrett, and it was clear that she was grappling with the consequences of her earlier actions. The courtroom, which had been holding its breath just moments before, now seemed to exhale in unison, the tension easing slightly as Barrett's attempt to regain her composure was met with silence. Crockett, however, wasn't about to let the moment pass without making her own point. She wasn't interested in seeing Barrett backtrack or retreat into her previous position. Instead, she saw this as an opportunity to drive home the significance of what had just transpired. "Judge Barrett," she said, her voice unwavering, "the truth cannot be manipulated no matter how hard you try. You can threaten me, you can try to silence me, but at the end of the day, I will not be intimidated. You may have the power of the court behind you, but I have the truth on my side." As she spoke, it was clear that Crockett had not only regained her footing, but had also gained an upper hand in this battle of wills. Her calm, measured response to Barrett's moment of regret was a testament to her strength and her ability to rise above the pressure of the situation. She was no longer just a congresswoman challenging a judge's authority. She had become a symbol of resistance, standing against the forces of power that sought to suppress her voice. Barrett's expression shifted once again, this time to one of acknowledgement. She recognized that she had miscalculated. In her attempt to maintain control of the courtroom, she had underestimated the tenacity of Crockett's resolve. It was a humbling moment for the judge, and for the first time since the trial began, the balance of power seemed to tip away from the bench and toward the congresswoman. Despite her initial authority, Judge Barrett had found herself on the defensive, struggling to reconcile the image of the powerful judge she had worked so hard to cultivate with the reality of the situation unfolding in the courtroom. The very thing she had feared, the loss of control, had come to pass. And now, as she attempted to regain her footing, she couldn't help but wonder what kind of consequences her earlier actions might have for the rest of the trial. The courtroom, once a place where she was the unquestioned authority, was now a battleground for something much larger, the fight for truth, power, and accountability. The aftermath of Judge Barrett's misstep rippled through the courtroom, and soon it became clear that the repercussions of her attempt to silence Congresswoman Crockett were far from over. What had begun as a carefully orchestrated trial, one where the judge held all the cards, had turned into a spectacle that nobody in the room could have predicted. Barrett had been rattled by Crockett's unwavering defiance, and now she was struggling to regain her authority. What had been a moment of calculated control had turned into a critical misjudgment, and the effects of that miscalculation were starting to unfold. Outside the courtroom, the story quickly spread, igniting discussions that extended far beyond the walls of the legal arena. News outlets were quick to pick up on the tension between the two women, and within hours the incident became one of the hottest topics in the media. Legal experts and political analysts weighed in, each offering their own interpretation of the events. But one thing was clear. The power dynamics had shifted. It wasn't just about the case anymore. It was about what Crockett had represented in that moment. She had stood up to the system, refusing to be cowed by authority. And in doing so, she had captured the imagination of the public in a way that even Judge Barrett's formidable reputation couldn't match. For Crockett, the fallout from the courtroom exchange was nothing short of a victory. She had walked into that trial with a clear purpose, to challenge a system that, in her view, had been designed to silence people like her. She had used the courtroom as a platform to speak truth, to power, and in doing so, she had turned the tables on Barrett. The media immediately latched onto her unwavering stance, framing her as the champion of justice who refused to be intimidated by a powerful judge. Interviews with political commentators soon followed, and the Congresswoman's words were broadcast to millions. She was no longer just a participant in a legal case. She had become the face of a broader movement for accountability. Barrett, on the other hand, found herself in an uncomfortable position. She had been the one expected to command respect, to maintain order, but the public narrative now painted her as someone who had faltered under pressure. The media, which had once celebrated her as a paragon of judicial discipline, was now questioning her judgment. Legal analysts debated whether her actions in the courtroom had undermined her credibility. Some argued that her attempt to control the situation had exposed a flaw in her impartiality, while others suggested that she had allowed her personal biases to influence her decisions. What had been a high-profile case in the courtroom was now a high-profile scandal in the public eye. The story even took on a personal dimension. People began to speculate about the motivations behind Barrett's actions. Had her threat to Crockett been rooted in personal politics? Was it a sign of her own frustration with the shifting political landscape? These questions, though speculative, began to take on a life of their own. It was clear that this moment of vulnerability would follow Barrett for a long time, coloring her public image in ways she hadn't anticipated. And as for the case at hand, the incident had a profound effect on how it would proceed. Legal experts began to question whether Barrett's handling of the situation had compromised the fairness of the trial. Some even suggested that the Congresswoman's challenge to Barrett's authority had cast doubt on the integrity of the entire process. As the trial dragged on, the focus shifted away from the specifics of the case itself and onto the dynamics between the judge and the Congresswoman. The courtroom, once a space where legal arguments and evidence took center stage, had become a battleground for power, truth, and accountability. Crockett, however, was unshaken. If anything, the controversy surrounding her confrontation with Barrett only fueled her determination. She saw the moment as a validation of her approach to justice, an approach that wasn't just about legal technicalities, but about holding those in power accountable. Her stance had resonated with a wide swath of the public, and she knew that, despite the judge's attempt to intimidate her, the truth had been made clear. The system needed reform, and she was one of the voices demanding it. Barrett, now in basic GI, the midst of a public relations crisis, faced a difficult road ahead. The very authority that she had once wielded with certainty now appeared fragile, and the courtroom, which had been her domain, was no longer the space where she had the upper hand. The questions that loomed over her were far more difficult to answer than those presented by the trial itself. The public was watching closely, and every move she made from that point forward would be scrutinized under a microscope. The balance of power in the courtroom had irrevocably shifted, and it was clear that both Barrett and Crockett had become symbols of something much larger than the case at hand. As the days passed and the echoes of the courtroom confrontation between Judge Amy Coney Barrett and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett continued to reverberate throughout the nation, it became clear that this was more than just a legal dispute. It was a symbolic moment in a larger fight for justice and accountability. The power dynamics had been shifted, and the public's attention had been drawn to something much deeper than the specifics of the trial itself. Crockett had emerged not just as a determined politician, but as a powerful symbol of resistance against a system she saw as flawed. Barrett, once seen as the embodiment of judicial authority, now found herself grappling with questions about her integrity, her motivations, and her ability to remain impartial in the face of overwhelming public scrutiny. The aftermath of the confrontation was felt on both sides. For Crockett, the media attention and public support only fueled her resolve. She had been steadfast in her belief that justice wasn't merely about legal procedure, but about ensuring that those in power were held accountable. In a country where the voices of the powerful often drowned out the cries of those demanding change, Crockett had stood firm. The trial had started as a legal matter, but it had turned into a stage for her to challenge the very structure of power, and she had done so with courage and conviction. The public began to see her not just as a congresswoman, but as a fearless advocate for justice, someone willing to speak truth to power regardless of the consequences. Barrett, on the other hand, faced a much more complicated aftermath. Her reputation, carefully built over years of legal service, and her rise to the Supreme Court had been called into question. She had been known for her strict adherence to the law, her poised demeanor, and her steadfast commitment to justice. But the exchange with Crockett revealed cracks in that carefully constructed facade. Her attempt to silence Crockett had been seen as an overreach, an abuse of the power she held, and a failure to recognize the very ideals of fairness and impartiality that the judiciary was meant to uphold. What had been a swift and decisive action in her mind, a way to restore order to the courtroom, was now viewed by many as a misstep that undermined the integrity of the judicial process. Public perception of Barrett began to shift. Media outlets, once quick to praise her for her composure and adherence to constitutional principles, now took a more critical stance. Legal analysts debated whether her actions had compromised her impartiality, with some suggesting that her behavior had been influenced by personal political leanings. The once celebrated judge now found herself at the center of a controversy that cast doubt on her ability to carry out her duties with the necessary neutrality. The question on everyone's mind became, could she continue to serve as a beacon of fairness, or had her judgment been clouded by personal biases? The trial, once a space for legal arguments, became a platform for a larger discussion on justice reform, political power, and the need for accountability. It wasn't just about the verdict anymore. It was about the message that was being sent. The way that Crockett had stood up to the judge, unwilling to back down no matter the cost, became a rallying cry for those who felt that the system was stacked against them. The public saw Crockett's defiance not as an act of disrespect, but as an act of courage. It was a stand against a system that often rewarded silence and submission, and a declaration that some voices, no matter how powerful or intimidating the opposition, could never be silenced. For Barrett, the moment was a turning point. The realization that her authority could be questioned, that her actions had sparked a public backlash, forced her to confront uncomfortable truths. She had entered the courtroom with the firm belief that she could maintain control and uphold the decorum that had always been her trademark. But in the end, it was Crockett who had taken control of the narrative. She had reminded everyone in the courtroom, and in the public at large, that the pursuit of justice could not be limited by the walls of the courtroom or the authority of a judge. It was something that transcended power, something that could not be contained by threats or intimidation. As the trial continued and the media frenzy subsided, both women knew that their fates had been altered. Crockett had secured her place in the annals of political history as a fierce advocate for justice, a woman who had dared to challenge one of the most powerful figures in the legal world and had come out victorious. Barrett, meanwhile, was left to rebuild her reputation, her image tarnished by the events of that day. The courtroom, once a place where she had been an unquestioned authority, had become a reminder that even the most powerful can be vulnerable, and that the pursuit of justice is not always as clear-cut as it seems. In the end, the confrontation between Judge Amy Coney Barrett and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett became more than just a dramatic courtroom exchange. It became a pivotal moment in the ongoing fight for justice, a reminder that power can be challenged, that truth can still shine through, and that the fight for what is right is never truly over. The world would remember the day when a congresswoman stood up to a judge and the lasting impact that moment had on the very system they both represented.